We are all in the debt of David Law Jeffrey for so many things here at Baylor, but you, all of us here at this conference are in his debt as well for his vision and contributions to art seeking understanding. So I'd like to invite him now to come say a few remarks. Please give your warm thanks to David Law Jeffrey.
Thank you, Darren, and indeed, a lot of thanks are due to Darren. Darren actually is not only responsible for organizing all of these conferences, but in this particular special case, he rescued a big failure on the part of David Lyle Jeffrey. And I want to just say briefly what it is, because it'll help you understand why you're here and why you're involved in this conversation, and I hope it'll make some sense of where we're going with the speaker tonight. About almost 4 years ago, the John Templeton Foundation decided that they wanted to invite proposals on the topic Art Seeking Understanding, our very topic here. And Bob Roberts and I have been friends and conversation partners for years, and conversations involving aesthetics and scripture and philosophy. And we thought, well, this is a great topic. And so we looked at the proposal invitation, and we discovered that they were primarily interested in neuroscience, in the measurement of people's responses, as you might be able to tell that by putting wires on their head and the like of that, you know. And we looked at each other and we said, I wonder what we know about neuroscience. And we decided that between the two of us together, what we knew was maybe fill the ear of a ladybug. So we thought, well, what can we do? Well, we'll persuade them that this isn't the right way to go. There's no accounting for enthusiasm in old men. So this particular approach that we took was actually encouraged. I don't know how many of you know the famous British neuroscientist, David Marr. But David Marr once said, rather famously, I think, that to try to study perception, paying attention only to neurons, is like trying to study flight in a bird, studying only feathers. That was probably not the right thing to say to the folks at Templeton, but anyway, what they did was they came back and they said, well, that's all very interesting, but we don't fund conferences. And that's where Darren came in. I was having a conversation with Darren, and I told him about this, and he said, yeah, but I'm interested in this conference. And I've always wanted to do something crazy with you, David. So, that's where we are. That's why we are here, in a sense. Darren being willing to pick up on the clumsiness left by his friend. Art seeking understanding is a phrase which you will understand as Christians, many of you, if not all, is a parallel to the phrase faith-seeking understanding, which is a very important phrase for us here at Baylor. Both of them involve the idea that there's a kind of a longing to go deeper. And when we say fide squarens intellectum, that's the motto of the Honors College, we're talking about people who have already started on a journey but want that journey to complete in some way, or at least get farther along. And in the case of art-seeking understanding, ars quaerens intellectum, what we're thinking about there is, and Bob and I talk extensively about this, is the way in which the arts, various kinds of the arts, and they're all but one that we wanted represented here in the conference, create something which leads to something more. They create a kind of stimulus which leads not just to what the cognitive aestheticians talk about, but it leads to a kind of satisfaction of yearning and an increase in that yearning. And so those of you who love the arts will know that the artist is never satisfied, and the one who enjoys the arts enjoys it thoroughly, but is never satisfied, wants more. There's something given that is not given in quite any other way. So in our conversation, we thought a lot about the Bible, as we typically do in our conversations, and we noticed that in the biblical tradition, art is not spoken of simply as an intellectual virtue like in Thomas Aquinas, although it doesn't contradict that, but it's a spiritual gift, as Darren mentioned last night. So if you go to the 25th and through the 31st chapter of the book of Exodus, you'll find that, God is speaking to Moses, and he says to Moses, I would really like you to build me something beautiful, an Ohel Moed, a place I can meet you that's special, that is Kodesh, set apart. But you're not fit for this job. So he says, but on the other hand, there's somebody out there named Bezalel, son of Uri, and Bezalel's name just means of the image of God. And he has a partner named Aholiab, and there's some women that do wonderful tapestry, and they've all got something you don't have, and that's Chokmah Lev. Now, Chokmah Lev means simply wise-heartedness. It's a very rich term. It means more than I can say readily here tonight, but it's something which is associated with art, specifically geared to invoke and apply transcendence. And by the way, it's a rare word in the Old Testament, as our speaker for tonight knows, but it does show up in 1 Kings 3:12, where after Solomon has been given his opportunity to ask a gift of the Lord, and he asks for wisdom, which is a good start, the Lord basically says, look, I'll go you one better. Not just Chokmah, but we'll have Chokmah Lev. And of course, Solomon, too, will build a temple for the Lord. So this begins to get you thinking, right? And you notice when you read the Old Testament that there's something very special about the poetics of the Old Testament. And you see I'm leading toward Dr. Strawn. When you read the Old Testament, if you read the prophets, for example, you notice that whenever God is going to speak, when the inverted commas go up, the Lord came to me saying, and then there they are, that all of a sudden it is poetry. And it's not just poetry. I mean, it's poetry which is the most elegant poetry. And it's there not just in the comfort passages, the Tuda voice passages like, Nakamo Ami, comfort ye my people. Or the magnificent 55th chapter of Isaiah. But it's there in the bitter passages, the Ada voice, It turns out, as you know, if you read the book of Job chapter 38, that God is speaking magnificent poetry even when he's ticked off. What are we to make of this, So those of us who try with our various efforts, philosophically, theologically, artistically, to understand God, to come to know God, realize, of course, knowing God involves having an appreciation for the mighty works which he has done. It involves knowing what he said, for sure. But it also clearly needs to involve having an appreciation and an understanding of how God says what he says. You might think that, it's only in the Old Testament, but that's wrong. So if Brent Strawn will forgive me, I'm going to mention something about the New Testament, which goes right along with what he's going to talk about. In the New Testament, Jesus uses poetry. You may not have noticed this, but in the Sermon on the Mount, when he says, ask and you shall receive. Seek and you shall find. Knock and the door shall be opened unto you. He's speaking Hebrew poetry. Well, we get it in Greek or English, but it's Hebrew poetry. The Lord's Prayer is a poem. And then there's that fabulous chapter 13 of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus has been teaching in parables, and the disciples come to him and they say, Lord, they're not getting it. Why do you always speak in parables? And the Lord says this enigmatic thing, which lots of critics have noticed. He says, because they see, they don't see. They look, they don't see, they listen, they don't really get it. And I do this in case they should hear and understand and repent, so to fulfill the words that the prophet Isaiah has spoken. So we get the idea that art also excludes some people. So just as art is a gift that not everybody gets, art is something which, in terms of the reception of art, is not designed for everybody. It's designed for some, not all. And then Jesus, of course, explains the parable of the sower to the disciples. And then he explains the parable of the tares to the disciples. And those are allegories. And then one after the other, he gives them kingdom parables, which are really similes, right? Like that pearl of great price. Like that shady character that's going across the field and he finds a treasure and he covers it over with his foot and runs out and buys the field. Kingdom of heaven is like that. Kingdom of heaven is like a great net thrown out there and it picks up all kinds of fish, good and bad. And the fishermen throw at the bottom feeders. Sorry, catfish lovers. And keep the good stuff. And then he asks the disciples, and listen to the words he uses. Have you understood these things? And things, of course, are the parables, the stories. And they say, yea, Lord. And I remember the first time I read that and thought about it, and I thought, maybe they're bluffing. But they say, yea, Lord. And then Matthew says something stunning. Nowhere did Jesus teach them anything without a parable. Jesus is in the New Testament an artist who is seeking understanding. Well, that set Bob and I to doing some thinking. And I said, well, there's a guy we need to get for this conference. And since Darren is willing to fund it, his name is Brent Strawn. And so I want to introduce Brent Strawn. He's currently the D. Moody Smith Professor, Distinguished Professor of Theology of the Old Testament at Duke University. He's also a professor in the law school at Duke. He was, for a while, a professor at Asbury, and then for 18 years, the William Ragdale Cannon Professor, Distinguished Professor of Old Testament Theology at Emory. He's got a tremendous CV, 250 or more than 250 chapters and articles, more than 25 books, wide range of topics in the Old Testament. But he has an ear, not a tin ear, but he has an ear for the language of the Old Testament. Some of his book titles may intrigue you, and I'm not going to pursue these topics tonight, and I hope he's not going to either, because it would take us right off topic. But he has a book called Lies My Preacher Told Me, an honest look at the Old Testament. I think that's Westminster John Knox last year. And then he has another book, which is of the same vein with Fortress, and which is called Honest to God Preaching, Sin, Suffering, and Violence in the Old Testament. He's got an introduction a concise introduction to the Old Testament with Rutledge in 2019. And he has a fantastic, really useful encyclopedia that I recommend to you, the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Bible and the Law, which came out in 2015 and won the Dartmouth Prize from the American Library Association for the very best reference work available in that year. Here's a multi-talented man who does a lot of wonderful things, but whose work is grounded in Scripture, and the kind of work it is attuned to the art of Scripture. So tonight, speaking on the topic, God's poesy. Why does the Lord speak in parables, in poetry, in the Pentateuch? Here is the Reverend Dr. Brent A. Strawn. Please welcome him.
Thank you for that. I wanted to keep hearing David speak. I think that's as good as we could hear tonight. Thank you for that. And thanks for everyone who's been a part of making my visit possible here. It's been a joy to be here for the conference, and a joy to be here to present this paper now for you. I should admit from the start that the question posed in my title here is unanswerable, at least by yours truly. For those of us who believe in the existence of the biblical God, as do I, the only entity able to answer this question would be the Lord God of Israel proper, right? This important theological point made, I also recognize that answering the question that I post here with "who knows" or "only God knows" would likely not bless the organizers of this conference. Then David and I wanted a little bit more than that for me. And so obviously something more will simply have to be said, even if only to take up the time allotted to me in the program. So here is the game plan. First, I will provide a short but hopefully complete overview of where poetry appears in the Pentateuch. I will then focus on the subset of Pentateuchal poetry that is ascribed to God, examining each in turn in terms of content and context. And after that, I hope we will be in a somewhat better position to answer the question, why does God speak in poetry in the Pentateuch and other places too? I've added that little part to the title. Now, one more admission before I begin, and that's to say that the time allotted me this evening is, how shall I put it delicately, considerably longer than I originally understood. In fact, I only recently learned that I had been given this lengthy and rather intimidating evening slot. Well, for better or for worse, once I learned of my extra time, I lived into it, writing a 30-page single-space draft. Now, I can't read all that, of course, and so I've trimmed things down. Hopefully, I didn't cut out all the good parts. That's a joke. That assumes there was some good parts. That wasn't a joke. Okay, all right. Well, at least a third of the Old Testament is comprised of poetry. And so a reduced focus like the present one on the Pentateuch is in order. But even with this reduced text base, the issue of identifying poetry is not easy. The task is easier said than done, and for more than one reason. The canons of Hebrew poetry are a matter of considerable debate among biblical scholars, but to delve too deeply into such arcane matters would likely bore you even more than I already am or soon will. So, as a compromise between reinventing the wheel or rehashing the field and putting us to sleep early, I collated 3 well-known English translations of the Hebrew Bible. The New Jewish Publication Society version, also known as the Tanakh, 1985, the New Revised Standard Version, 1989, and the Common English Bible, 2011, to see which texts they set in poetic lineation. I also collated the 5th edition of the Biblia Hebraica Stuc Artensia, the standard scholarly edition of the Hebrew Bible used by translators, and the 3 extant fascicles of Biblia Hebraica Quinta, which will be the new standard edition once it's complete. Between these 5, here is a combined listing of the data. The results are intriguing. There are differences, of course, between these translations, but also a decent bit of overlap, suggesting that in these cases, at least, the texts in question are almost certainly poetic. But even the points of convergence raise questions. If something like Exodus 32:18 is deemed poetic, why are other texts not deemed the same? Consider, for example, Exodus 19:3b. This line is at least as poetic as 32:28. Now, the problem, therefore, of identifying biblical poetry can't be resolved here, but I also just want to point out we can't forget it. The larger observation is simply that there may be considerably more poetry in the Pentateuch than is sometimes thought. The corpus is further enlarged if one includes secondary treatments. As an example, I quote here Dwayne Garrett's 2013 commentary on Exodus, which identifies 8 poems that stretch across the book. That leads to what might be called honorable mentions. Texts that are prose but have been considered nearly poetic or quite poetry-like by interpreters. First and foremost among these, if only due to canonical order, has to be Genesis 1, which I'll come back to in a minute. Another text is the Decalogue. Another, the genealogies peppered throughout the Torah. These latter genealogies likely strain our modern poetic sensibilities. Repetition of formulae isn't the same thing as poetry, we might protest, which is true. But repetition of formulae is part of what makes Genesis 1 seem, or really be, poetic. So, to add to the strained credulities, I would note that Jason Gaines, no relation to Chip and Jo as far as I know, Thank you. I worked that hard on that one. That's a Waco joke, right? I mean, that was just too good not to true. Gaines has argued that a poetic original underlies the priestly narrative in the Pentateuch. Wait, what? Leviticus poetry? Yes, Leviticus poetry, according to Gaines. And if that's true of priestly narrative, what of priestly and non-priestly legislation? I've already mentioned the Ten Commandments, but another example could be those instances of poetic justice where the punishment fits the crime. No more, no less. This is nowhere more true than in the case of the lex talionis, where the formulation is as balanced as any instance of very, very tight parallelism. Now, if there is more poetry in the Pentateuch than is sometimes recognized, the converse is also possible. Texts that have been identified as poetry in the past may not be that. And so again, the issues besetting any identification of poetry in the Pentateuch or beyond are vexed. At a minimum, we can agree that matters of form and style and content and subject matter should be considered whenever we're determining where and when we are dealing with poetry. So, in the interest of filling my lengthy time slot, I've cast the net widely, attempting to capture as much poetry or potential poetry as possible. Here, then, is a listing of the poems in the Pentateuch drawn from the previous aggregated data set. This list is a maximal one, and so includes the honorable mention of Genesis 1, a text my colleague at Duke, Ellen Davis, has called Israel's poem of creation. But I've also bracketed that, along with the additional text from Garrett, since not all agree about the poetic status of these passages, but that's how it goes. The details are lively, the debates are considerable, as I've already said. Okay, so now that we have a workable list here, and the green ones are these additional honorable mentions or debatable passages, as long as we have this workable list, we can turn to the main question. If the reasons why God speaks in poetry in the Pentateuch remain elusive in terms of divine essence, that is, only God could say why, we can nevertheless pursue the question in terms of textual evidence. So let's begin at the beginning. If we assume the poetry-like nature of the first chapter of Genesis, the Bible begins with a poetic-ish account of creation. Life, the universe, and everything begins with a jussive verb, let there be, yehi in Hebrew, which is followed by its consequence in the indicative, and there was, vayehi. The balanced pair continues on after day one, where it receives further peppering via new repetitions and new rhythms. God saw X, that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, day Y. The recurrent formulae of verbal sequence, seeing and assessing and morning and evening, aren't enough, however. More patterns are layered in. The rhythm of the 7-day week that culminates in Shabbat and that folds in on itself by pairing the created entities of days 1 and 4, 2 and 6, and 2 and 5, and 3 and 6. The result is a truly regal arrangement of the creative act and the creative order. It's hard to imagine a more majestic presentation that is, at the same time, remarkably mundane, structured on the all too familiar passage of time in the cycle of weeks, populated by heavenly bodies and sea monsters, sure, but also run-of-the-mill fish, birds, even creepy, crawly things. The great African-American poet Gwendolyn Brooks once described poetry as life distilled. By this definition, Genesis 1 certainly qualifies as poetry, capturing the poetry of the Creator within poetry about the Creator and the creation. This, then, is how Scripture begins, with the poetry of God's creative activity, with the poesis that is making. And of course, the two are the same thing. Since Genesis 1 is something of an honorable mention, our first clear instance of an extended piece of first-person divine poetry is Genesis 3:14-19, the so-called divine curses that follow human disobedience in the Garden of Eden. So-called because the man and the woman are not cursed, at least not directly. Only the snake is cursed directly, with the ground cursed indirectly. This divine poetry is even more mundane than Genesis 1. It's punitive, after all, and includes reasons for the less than desirable realities of life, the various degrees of alienation between humans and animals, between humans and the environment, between male and female. The content of this poetry is more sober than sublime, but the poetic form likely plays an important role regardless. It captures these fundamental ruptures even as it explains them in a memorable form. Poetry forces slow, careful reading attention, and Genesis 3 is no exception in this regard. Slow, careful reading of these poetic maledictions may fix them in mind, which in turn might prevent their misunderstanding or misapprehension. Next up is Genesis 4, where God again speaks poetically at a profound juncture, the moment before Cain's fateful act of killing his brother. God the poet, using arresting language, poetry, to address Cain before his fateful act. God does this and asks Cain why twice and sets his downcast countenance in contrast to a possible uplifting. That future state of uplifting hinges on if you do right. That is balanced by an ominous if you do not do right, which is followed by the first mention of sin in the Bible, here imagistically described as if it were an animal crouched at Cain's front door. The poem ends in an opaque three-word line, Ve'ata timshol bo. What does that line mean now, east of Eden? One note. Yeah, this is a little Steinbeck joke, if you followed East of Eden. This is how Steinbeck's novel ends, with timshol bo. The verb is where the action is, and also where the interpretation lies. Can Cain master sin? Should Cain master sin? Must he master sin? Will he master sin? All of these are possible in the verb form. Cain falls short of any and all mastery, of course, but God's last line, no less than Steinbeck's, lingers. The next text is Genesis 8. It should be observed that this poetry takes place inside the divine mind. The Pentateuch asserts that God recites poetry in God's own head. If poetry's memorability and memorizability are at work in this poem too, it means that this bit of poetry reminds God of the new anti-flood policies moving forward. Next up, Genesis 9. Here, poetry intrudes into a new stage in human food consumption. After the flood, God permits humans to eat animals with a restriction: no blood can be consumed. God then shifts from eating to killing, and then, oddly enough, to homicide. Then comes the poetry. There's a great deal of wordsmithing going on here, especially in verse 6. But be that as it may, the content is rather dour, even legal. Verse 7 shifts to something brighter, repeating the creational commands of Genesis 1. And this first word in verse 7, ve'atem, and you, is unnecessary grammatically, but its poetic effect is both emphatic and disjunctive. Rather than do those other sorts of things, or instead of that, now you all go and be something different. Don't be about death, homicide, but be about life. God's next poetic utterance is the call of Abraham, chapter 12. Here, the start of something really big is presented in poetic form, concisely. The poetry accompanies and clarifies the decisive imperative to Abraham, go forth, which is found in verse 1. The dominant verbs are of blessing and are cohortatives. Cohortatives are a type of construction that conveys great interest or desire on the part of the speaker. Something like, oh, please let me make of you a great nation. Oh, let me please bless you. Oh, let me please make your name great. And all of that is toward an end and for a purpose. So Abram himself will be a blessing. The cohortative forms that are found here continue into the first part of verse 3. Oh, let me please bless you, bless those, plural, that bless you. And then that verb form ends abruptly in the second half of the verse, which is disjunctive syntactically. But the one person who might curse you, I will curse. The poem ends with another result clause, bringing a nice closure to what turns out to be an envelope structure. And given the poetry of that last clause, its meaning is open-ended and elusive. The big question concerns the meaning of the verb. Is it passive or reflexive? Opinions differ and not infrequently fall out along Christian and Jewish lines, with the passive being more Christian interpretations, reflexive being more in the Jewish interpretations. Perhaps the poetry, however, knows better, with both options viable. If so, it is God the poet who knows better than so many of this poet's well-meaning but far more prosaic sons and daughters, so prone to schism and contention. God's poetic ways with Abram continue in Genesis 15, which is something of a twin to chapter 12. Both initiate a stage in his journey with poetry. In this second poetic start, God's poem can be briefer, but is emphatic nevertheless. It begins with an oracular utterance often used in military contexts, "do not fear," before representing God with a military metaphor, the shield. The third line can be read as consequent to the first two, with the result being that your reward will be very great. But the Hebrew is actually unspecific with regard to time frame. Your reward is very great and is just as possible as the future. In context, the content of this poem makes good sense. The previous chapter has Abram in warrior mode, rescuing Lot, his nephew, from a coalition of 4 kings, after which he's blessed by the mysterious Melchizedek, who is also something of a poet. But given the successful military and financial outcomes of that battle, the poem here in 15:1 seems a bit odd. Perhaps the divine poet knows that despite prior success, Abraham is still a long way off from Genesis 21, the birth of Isaac, let alone chapter 22, the near sacrifice of Isaac. Hence the divine assurance, the divine metaphor, and the openness to the last line to Abram's reward being in the future very great. In this instance, therefore, God's poetry connects to what has come before, even as it opens up to the future. Genesis 15:15, just a touch later in the same chapter, showcases God's poetry also being about the future, speaking of Abram's death as the patriarch sleeps. The prose that precedes this poem presages Israel's long sojourn and slavery in Egypt. At that point, God's attention turns back to the elderly patriarch who worries a lot about the future. The poem God utters is nothing short of a deathbed blessing, promising peace and burial at a good old age. So like Genesis 8 or 9, here's another case where God's poetry is evidently as much for the divine self as anyone else. Abraham is, after all, sleeping. The next bit of poetry is uttered to Hagar in chapter 16. It begins with a couplet followed by 2 tricola marked by much repetition. The poetry is evocative, especially in the last tricolon where different interpretations abound. What exactly is the wild mule of a man? That's the question. Is that a compliment? You try it out, see how it goes. The openness of the poetry continues into the next lines as well. Despite so many English translations, Ishmael's bellicosity actually has to be inferred. Here is a much more wooden rendition. Ishmael's hand will be on all, and the hand of all on him. He will lodge before all his brothers. The poetry is very, very breezy at this point. Said differently, God's poetry invokes and invites an unknown future for Ishmael, which is exactly what pans out in the rest of Genesis. We just can't say much more about Ishmael. His story lives outside the biblical narrative in the space between these poetic lines. The next poem, in Genesis 25, makes clear that God, in OBGYN mode, likes to break the news of pregnancy in poetic form. I am not qualified to say if this helps or not. But in this particular passage, God's poem reveals that Rebekah's difficult pregnancy is due to the fact that she's having twins. The poem may not help her out with preterm labor, but it does explain the situation and exposits what is to come. It turns out that these twins are not, in fact, babies after all, but already in the womb, nations and peoples. One of these will be stronger than the other, common enough among twins, of course, and so also the case for Rebekah's twins who are actually nations. But a twist comes in the last line, which uses terms that are usually more about size than about time. So something like this, and the big one will serve the little one. How does that last line gel with the previous ones? Jacob is initially weaker, but ends up the stronger people group. Does that mean he will end up serving the Esau people group? Esau is apparently the stronger twin boy, but is never said to serve Jacob. Does Esau as nation do that somehow later? And how could the Esau group do that, since as a people group, the Esauites are weaker and so should be served by the stronger Israel? If this is confusing to you, join the club. I am confused by it as well. God's poetry here, precisely because it is poetry, makes figuring things out trickier than it might otherwise be, which prefigures, if not predestines, the tricky and trickstery narrative that follows. If the poetry was straightforwardly about babies, it would likely be clear, but it isn't. It is instead about people groups, which complicates matters and invites readers and listeners to fill in the gaps. And that's exactly what Rebecca does. Said differently, this poem reveals some things, but not everything, and what follows shows Rebecca acting decisively in favor of her youngest child. The divine poetry God utters to her may not have required that action, but it in no small way spurs it on. The last divine poem in Genesis involves a name change for Jacob. The verbless construction of the first line is evocative. Your name is Jacob is how most translations put it, but the past tense is again equally possible. Your name was Jacob, but no longer. This is now the second time that Jacob has been renamed. The first took place at an evening wrestling event. Unlike that account, the poem here has God, not a nondescript nighttime wrestler, renaming the wily patriarch. Jacob's new name, Israel, contains the divine name El, God, which is also used in the next verse, God's self-designation as El Shaddai. El Shaddai is often associated in Genesis with blessing and fertility, also in Job, so it's not surprising that the poem proceeds to two imperatives that harken back to those fundamental verbs of Genesis 1, be fertile and increase. The next line recalls the poem of Genesis 12, only now becoming a nation seems just too small. The divine poet revises that vision just as the poet revised Jacob's name, right in the middle of a clause. Look at the poetry. Your name is Jacob. Wait, scratch that. No longer will you be called Jacob. A nation. No, wait, scratch that. An assembly of nations will come from you. And not just nations, but heads of state. Kings will descend from Jacob. The last lines of the poem focus on and end definitively with the word land. Nations and heads of state need land, and in this poem, Jacob gets it, and so does his offspring after him, who are nothing less than a great big congregation of nations replete with royal leadership. This poem promises a great deal, and does so in a concrete way that recapitulates almost everything that has come before it in Genesis. Jacob, accordingly, is moved to worship and to his own act of renaming. The place where this poem was uttered, he now calls God's house, Bethel. We now move to Exodus, and hang in there, we're halfway there. First up is Exodus 3:15b, where the Lord includes, I'm going back, previous. There we go. Exodus 13b, where the Lord includes a poetic couplet in the rather confusing discussion of what exactly God's name is. At first, if you remember the story, God's name is I am who I am, or something like that. Then it's just I am, but then becomes a rearticulation of the name as the Lord, Yahweh. Then that is immediately defined as the God of Israel's ancestors. And after this comes the poetry, which is sure to clear it all up. Perhaps not, but in context, this couplet is an artful conclusion to the giving of God's name. One gets the impression that its owner is pleased with this name, given its antiquity and perpetuity. And the poem is, accordingly, a delightful little lyric celebrating the name and its gravity. The next poem is one of the additional poems identified by Garrett, though with different lineation and a different translation than he offered, I put here on the slide. I admit that I am not convinced this unit is poetic, at least not all the way through, but if we allow for a temporary wideness in our poetic mercy, I think Garrett's analysis of the passage is quite insightful. In context, he says, this passage is meant to encourage Moses, who's fallen into despair over the apparent failure of his mission. How does the poem accomplish that task? In part by its specific content, of course, but also by its poetics, particularly the fourfold repetition of I am the Lord, in yellow here on the slide. Garrett himself lines these three of these out as separate refrains. I haven't done that in the slide. But the third in the sequence of I am the Lord statements is not self-standing like the others, but is part of a larger syntactical context. That is, the third one on the slide here in yellow could have been a refrain, but it isn't because it has a grammatical adjunct, your God who freed you. This fuller description of who the Lord is clarifies the meaning of the refrains that don't have that. I am the Lord by itself now means, be given this definition, I am the Lord your God who delivered you. That's no small matter because I am the Lord will be used extensively later in Exodus, and this is the very first time it appears in the book. So this unit unpacks and defines a great deal of divine character and activity. Next up is Exodus 15:25-26, another one of these additional poems identified by Garrett. This unit follows hard upon the well-known Song of the Sea in chapter 15, which is sung by Moses and all the Israelites and then repeated by Miriam and all the women. If Garrett is right that this unit is poetry, it offers a kind of counterpoint to the Song of the Sea, which celebrates the destruction of the Egyptians. That poem is third person, about God, with a bit of second person peppered in, you, God. Now, however, with 15:25-26, we have first person poetry, I, God. The poem culminates in an I am the Lord statement, here defined as a healer who performs healing precisely for you in the individualized singular form of that pronoun. The poetry is contingent, with much hanging on the if of obedience, the third line right there. But two things are worth noticing at this point. First, there is no explicit marker where the then part of the if-then statement begins. That's called the apodosis, if you want to know the fancy word and use it at your next cocktail party. Apodosis is the technical term for the then part of an if-then construction. That's lacking explicitly in the poetry here. It must be inferred for the sake of English translation. And of course, it can be inferred. But marking of the apodosis is usual in these types of constructions, but it's absent here. That's not unheard of by any means, but perhaps this is divine poetry at work. And if so, the lack of an explicit apodosis makes the then almost automatic, fully sequential, and naturally consequential. If that is true, perhaps it undermines the severity of the if clause to begin with. That is to say, does the divine poetry slide toward healing even without obedience? Perhaps that's too speculative. So the second thing worth noting is happily more secure. It's the specific content of this passage. The Lord had just been hymned in militaristic and violent ways as a warrior in the Song of the Sea. And such a metaphorical presentation is powerful. Figurative language, Wayne Booth once said, wants to colonize the mind. In the Song of the Sea, those predications of God as warrior are made by others about God. In the unit at hand, God's own self-predication is not that of warrior, but of healer. No wonder then that the dreaded afflictions of Egypt do not apply. Israel can and will experience God differently, not as destroyer, but as healer. And Israel can and will experience the Lord that way because of this poem. That's the next poem. Blue is what it's called. No, it's not, but maybe the screen will come back. The next poem is actually from Exodus 19. It's coming back, maybe? Working on it? Technical difficulties? Exodus 19:3 I already raised as a possibility of being poetry. Garrett concurs with this and thinks the surrounding verses are also poetic. So here's another unit where that depends heavily on the if of covenantal obedience. But in this case, the apodosis, the then clause, is clearly marked. In this case, the apodosis concerns Israel, not God. And that's interesting, isn't it? It wasn't marked with God, it is marked with Israel. Perhaps the consequential then of God can go unmarked, sliding toward automaticity. The same, however, cannot be said of the human side of the if-then construction, especially if they concern proper ethics. Regardless, obedient Israel can be described with three dense images in close combination, each with its own set of rich associations: a treasured possession, a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. Between the first two of those descriptions is a detail that must not be missed. It's in yellow here on the slide. The first word in the phrase, Hebrew ki, could be translated indeed, all the earth is mine, is in the NJPSV here, or it could be translated as because all the earth is mine in the Common English Bible. The poetry allows for either one, with the first option setting the record straight lest Israel overestimate itself. Being the Lord's treasured possession is not the same thing as being God's only possession. The second option, because the earth is mine, segues nicely into a focus on Israel's priestly and holy tasks. The line can lean either way syntactically and in either interpretation. So in this way, the line chastens the election at work in the first image, treasured possession, while introducing, by mentioning the whole earth, the reason for Israel's priestly duties and holy status. This one line thus simultaneously educates and commissions, corrects and directs in just 4 words and 6 syllables. Pretty good. More generally, we can observe that this larger unit begins the Sinaitic covenant with balance and style, which suggests that the law that follows, which often feels prosaic at best, pedantic at worst, is also something of beauty, also something marked by symmetry and balance. A beautiful law deserves to be beautifully introduced by means of beautiful poetry, and vice versa. Exodus 29 is the last additional unit of poetry that's been identified by Garrett. It's similar to the unit in chapter 6, in which case chapter 29 might be seen as answering or fulfilling the earlier text. The lines in this unit are very much on the move. God is said to meet with, or God will meet with all of you, plural, but then will speak to you, singular, before meeting with the Israelites. Everyone, as it were, invited, mixed up, confused. You, y'all, Moses, all y'all, Israel, each, all of the above, etc., yet with uber clarity as to where this meeting will happen. There, thrice repeated, once per addressee, so there can be no confusion as to the location of the meeting. The addressee then shifts again. The divine poet next speaks internally, recounting what God will do, speaking of the meeting spot and the priests and Israel in the third person. It's not you or y'all anymore, but the Israelites, or them. This poetry is thus another case of the poet reciting divine poetry internally. It ends with another I am the Lord statement, followed not by your God this time, but their God. And that is how the interior divine poetry concludes. In Exodus 6, the addition of your God who clarified the identity of the self-predicating Lord. At the end of the unit here in chapter 29, there's no further predication, perhaps because of the previous lines, which are full of descriptors of who God is. Or perhaps for another reason. Perhaps it is because God need no longer define the divine self vis-a-vis the divine acts for Israel. But now, at the unit's end, simply and only with reference to Israel. Who is the Lord, one might ask, even, according to this passage, Yahweh himself? The answer that comes is their God. That's who Yahweh is. Israel's God, period, full stop, end of poem. If that's correct, it casts more light on the next poem and the raw emotions on display after the betrayal of the covenant in the golden calf debacle, which, in my line of work, we call Calf Gate. Thank you. I'm here for a little longer. This deep rupture is resolved only slowly and with several hiccups and false starts along the way. But toward the end of the process, God appears and utters a crucial bit of divine poetry, the last to appear in the book of Exodus. It's known in German as the Gnadenformel, the grace formula, and it is repeated enough times in the Old Testament that it seems the closest thing ancient Israel ever got to a creed. On the slide is my own rendition of this poem, which depends on an article that appeared in this book in 2018 by Cooey, edited by Cooey and James, Biblical Poetry in the Art of Close Reading. The parenthetical, smaller text in blue reflects how, in my judgment, according to this prior study, some lines of the poem anticipate and or reaffirm other lines. For more on all that, I referred to the earlier article. Tonight, you'll just have to trust me. If you do, this situation means that the Gnadenformel is less linear in terms of logic and less straightforward in terms of syntactical relationships than is typically thought. Now, even on a quick read, it's clear that benevolence outweighs judgment in this poem. God forgives 3 things, but only punishes 1. God shows chesed to thousands, but punishes only to the 4th generation. The effects of the double duty colored lines here make divine benevolence even more extensive. God's character turns out to be highly flexible and porous, not unlike so much poetry. Ultimately, not simply or predominantly benevolent, according to this poem, but superabundantly, if not almost exclusively benevolent. But why would God utter such a poem and at this particular juncture in Exodus? Well, first, after the unimaginable breach of covenant in Calfgate, what is needed is nothing less than a full and total pardon. Walter Moberly has described the golden calf debacle as the equivalent of committing adultery on your wedding night. So forgiveness is an issue, right? A full and total pardon is the only thing that can get through that. The content and poetics of the Gnaden formals show that God is fully capable of that type of clemency, even more than is usually recognized, I think. And yet, this poem also holds that mercy in lyric tension with the continued capacity of God to punish. That too is on order. Both sides of the deity must be acknowledged, even though they are decisively, even exponentially imbalanced. Both sides have to be acknowledged, not only because both are true, but also because of what has transpired at Sinai. The Lord's merciful side must be admitted, since the breach wrought by the calf is too profound, the cut too deep, to imagine that it could be repaired quickly or easily. Only a superabundance of mercy could do that. At the same time, God's punitive side must also be acknowledged. The covenant wound is deep for both parties because the costs paid by Israel after its sin are severe, even deadly. Both aspects of God have to be acknowledged, and so both aspects are present. The fact that both trace back to a singular point of origin, the divine poet, and this divine poem, indicates that these two sides cohere despite their tension. Yes, the Lord can and did punish. Israel is thus put on notice in the case of future covenantal crises. The Lord does and will punish should the need arise again, but the poetry says still more. God can and does and will also forgive and is overwhelmingly predisposed to doing so. The poetry, therefore, says what could not be communicated as easily, as memorably, or as profoundly otherwise. That's a good poem, therefore, to become creedal in the Bible. We should note, finally, that this poem, too, is about God, but uttered by God. Moses is listening in, but the deity, too, benefits from hearing this recital. Well, we move now to Leviticus. Leviticus has only one snippet of divine poetry, according to these texts I surveyed. It comes after the death of Nadab and Abihu for offering unholy fire. Moses explains what has happened by quoting God the poet to Aaron, their father. Now, the jury is out on whether Moses offered good pastoral care here in this situation to Aaron. But the poem is presented as something pre-existing and so isn't tied solely to the immediate literary context. The poem, as you can see, is a brief couplet about God's sanctification and glorification, where it happens. It happens among those who are near the Lord and in the presence of all the people. These two lines by themselves capture much of what the entire book of Leviticus is about writ large. Divinity amidst humanity is for better and for worse in Leviticus. In the case of Nadab and Abihu, it's definitely for the worse. The poem thus reflects something of a divine mystery. When it is performed, as happens with the strange fire or in Moses' citation, that mystery is solved or flexed in one direction or another, at least temporarily. But in itself, the mystery of and the mystery in the poem remains. The next divine poem is the priestly blessing of Numbers 6:23 to 26, a famous text. It's also one that is to be performed. Here, a poem about God is to be recited by the priests. In practice then, both back then and even now up to the present day, this poem is said by others and not by the divine poet. The literary context, however, indicates that this poem is one of God's own works, and as a result, the divine poet speaks about the divine self in this poem. This phenomenon, which we've observed a few times already, including in Exodus 34, has wide-ranging ramifications. I'll return to it at the end of my talk. Numbers 12 is the next divine poem. Here, God utters poetry after the dust-up with Miriam and Aaron about Moses' Cushite wife. Miriam and Aaron end up challenging Moses' unique status as God's mouthpiece, and the Lord is not pleased when God hears of it. And an intervention of sorts is arranged at the tent of meeting. And at that moment, God delivers this poem. It's obviously in praise and defense of Moses, but it accomplishes its work quite cleverly. First, God admits of the possibility of another prophet. Just one, though. Just one, a prophet. by means of the hypothetical particle if this is admitted as a possibility, hypothetically. Communication between God and such a hypothetical prophet, should there even be one, would have to be mediated, however, through a vision. Again, singular, apparently just one, or in a dream, again, just one. The next line begins with the strongest of adversities. It is not so with Moses, who is described with the honorific title, my servant. And then, what a servant, trustworthy over God's entire house. So in contrast to the singular hypothetical prophet who is at some communicative disadvantage, God speaks to Moses face to face. This interaction is next described with a word, mar'eh in Hebrew, which is almost identical to the word bamara in a vision that was used with the hypothetical second-order prophet. English versions often translate this mar'eh as clearly in the NRSV or plainly NJPSV, which makes good sense given the rest of the line. But such a rendering might make the line unnecessarily redundant. So another translation is the visibly by the Common English Bible, which I follow here, which also suits the context, given the next line, which asserts this stunning fact that Moses sees the Lord's form. A different verb for seen is used here, further distinguishing Moses from some run-of-the-mill hypothetical prophet. The poem ends with a very pointed question: who would be fool enough to speak against my servant, Moses, with the adversative preposition against repeated twice, no doubt for emphasis. The final divine poem in Numbers is found in 14:18, which is a citation of the Gnaden formal, which we've already discussed. The citation is not exactly verbatim, and what Moses leaves out is not insignificant, but for present purposes, this is not a new poem from the divine poet. It is instead a piece of divine poetry memorized, perhaps inexactly, by an admirer, who then uses it to change the author's mind about great disaster. What Moses does here is effectively make the divine poet quote divine poetry back to the divine self. Moses is, as it were, an extension of the Lord's frontal cortex in Numbers 14. And with that, we come at last to the final piece of divine poetry in the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy 32, which is far too long to reproduce on my slides. It is of fantastic significance, however, that the book of Deuteronomy, and thus the Torah as a whole, ends with poetry, and with two poems, to be precise. Chapter 33 is the blessing of Moses, his final words to Israel before he finally signs off in chapter 34 after a very, very long sermon. Chapter 32, the great poem known as Ha'azinu, after its first Hebrew word, is God's poetry. It's a divine poem that God teaches Moses so that he in turn might teach it to Israel. Deuteronomy 32, therefore, is the ultimate finale of Deuteronomy and the Torah when it comes to Israel and God. And this climax, this ultimate finale, comes in a poem. The learning and teaching of this poem is necessary, according to Deuteronomy, because despite all the careful, even laborious work of explicating and repeating the Torah that Moses and God have been engaged in throughout Deuteronomy, despite all that, God makes clear that as soon as Moses dies, Israel will turn away. Moses' very, very long sermon is, at the end of the day, apparently all for naught. But not entirely for naught, because God has a poem in mind that will fix things. The poem is thus designed for exactly after all seems lost, or rather, when all really is lost. This poem will serve as God's witness against the Israelites, confronting them as a witness, because, Deuteronomy says, it will not be lost from the mouths of their descendants. Moses, therefore, takes dictation, dutifully writing the poem down, and subsequently recites it to the whole assembly of Israel. All of those textual details come from chapter 31, which is actually somewhat confusing as to what Moses actually writes down. It's this law in verse 9, but then this poem in verse 22, and then in verse 24, it's the words of this law to the very end, written down in a book. So there's some serious overlap or blending or confusion between this law, book of the law, and poem. The poem gets the last say, however. After Moses' last will and testament, his very long sermon, comes God's own last will and testament in verse, in a poetic version of Torah. Even Deuteronomy, the juggernaut that it is in the Old Testament, is incomplete without an ending that is poetic. even lyrical. Exodus 19 inaugurated the covenant with poetry. Deuteronomy 32 brings it to close with the same. The poem is not, however, what we might expect. If we expect the poem to be somehow synonymous with the law that has come before, we learn otherwise. It does not explicate the law or recapitulate legal statutes. It does something quite different. It begins with a first-person speaker calling the heavens to attend to the words that follow. The poetic plot is introduced in verses 4 to 5, which describe God as the rock whose work is perfect, who's faithful, just, and upright. So far, so good. The poetic problem is that this rock has children, which is a biological anomaly, to be sure. But nevertheless, this rock has children. The children are false, perverse, and crooked. This disconnect, great dad, lousy kids, is worsened by the following summary of how much God did for these children. They really should know better. This history of disappointment is reported until verse 15, where suddenly the poetry breaks from third-person discourse about Israel to directly address the audience in second-person discourse. The lineation on the slide shows how the middle line is intrusive. Without it, the verse is comprised of two nicely balanced bicola. The second-person forms of the intrusive line are completely out of place. What's happening here is that the poetry and its poet is inscribing the audience directly into the poem. This unexpected intrusion anticipates verse 18, which does the same thing, shifting from they sacrificed to demons, not to God, to second-person forms. You. We see now why it makes good sense to say that the poem confronts Israel and serves as a witness against it. Like it or not, the poem says to Israel, this poem is about you. But Israel proves to be a poet in training, learning how to write in verse at God's own poetic need. Later in verse 31, Israel writes itself into a crucial part of the poem. This, in fact, is the real turning point in the poem. After this, everything is not lost because God is not the rock anymore, but our rock. And our rock turns 180 degrees against Israel's enemies that were previously used by God as the punitive tool of choice. The poetry changed radically at this verse. The poet now chooses to vindicate Israel and have compassion on God's people. So these two types of inscription differ, obviously. In the first, Israel is inscribed passively, as an object acted upon, and acted upon for judgment. You grew fat, you grew lazy, you grew satiated. But in the second, Israel reinscribes itself as an active subject, reinserting itself into the stanza and to a remarkable effect for doxology and into transformation. This second inscription works. The poem bends towards, even enacts new ways of God's being toward Israel and toward Israel's enemies after this second inscription. And that, of course, means that the first inscription also worked. The second inscription depends entirely upon it. The audience has learned from the first type of inscription for judgment, and then at the key moment practices that move itself exactly when the audience needs it most. It's not going too far, I don't think, to say that the poem and Israel's relationship with God is entirely up in the air, indeterminate, fraught, and perilously so until verse 31, and this second reinsertion, this reinscription. This remarkable poem ends in praise of the incomparable God and in praise of God's incomparable people. And that isn't a bad way to end Deuteronomy or the Torah or anything else for that matter. The degenerate children at the end of Deuteronomy or the Torah or anything, the degenerate children at the start of Deuteronomy 32, I should say, which are also the same degenerate children at the start of Genesis, are, by the end of the Pentateuch's poetry, nothing less than the restored, redeemed, and praiseful people of God. Incomparable. What should be underscored once more is that it's the Torah's lyrical ending that accomplishes this work, and it's nothing less than divine poetry. The changes in the divine character that are evident in the poem are here, that is, because the divine poet put them here. The inscription of Israel, therefore, and Israel's own self-inscription, both are present here by design. These are part and parcel of the poetics of the final piece of divine poetry in the Pentateuch. This last poem, and particularly the stunning dynamics of inscription herein, attest to a divine poet teaching a lot of other little poets in training, so that they in turn can read, understand, and even write themselves into the very poetry of God. Verse 31 shows how that strategy works, shows that it works. Later biblical testimony about this poem, from Joshua to Josiah to the 2nd and 4th Maccabees to Revelation, all together offer evidence that this specific poem, Ha'azinu, Deuteronomy 32, was indeed never lost from their mouths and never will be. Instead, this poem has been there on time and on point, doing its work at the most important and grave of circumstances. All the circumstances during which this poem has been performed, enacted, enfleshed, often at great cost. So, why does God speak in poetry in the Pentateuch? The poetic climax of Torah is quite clear that a decent part of the answer must be due to poetry's memorability. Good lyrics get in our brains like earworms, and we simply can't get them out of our head. Bad lyrics do the same, even worse. Poetry, again, is memorable and memorizable, words that mean more and sound better, to quote Billy Collins. Poetry can and will be remembered, and in Deuteronomy's terms, remembering reads directly to obeying. That is one very good reason, perhaps the primary or preeminent reason that God speaks in poetry in the Pentateuch. Well, at least for Deuteronomy 32. But there are other poems, no less than 21 other divine poems in the Torah, maybe even more, and not all are of the piece. So in an important study, James Watts argued that poetry inset into narrative, like we've looked at tonight, is a literary device that's used to achieve compositional goals. Well, that seems obvious and true, also rather general. Surely more can be said. And Watts does just that, noting how poems in narrative contexts often occur at or near the end of a narrative block, and so play some sort of concluding role to bring the narrative to a climax, a finale of some sort. Psalmody, the use of poetry as a means for narrative closure, suggests, according to Watts, that ancient Hebrew writers and editors found some inherent advantage in its use. One such advantage is that it invites readers to join in the celebration, Watts says. And he proceeds to compare the use of songs as punctuations in certain sorts of Broadway-style musical theater. That seems right to me and moves the why question away from generic compositional goals to issues of performance and effect, factors that Deuteronomy 32 already manifests. Watts' comments are helpful, but God's poetry in the Pentateuch does not always appear in final climactic position in certain narrative units. Neither is all of God's poetry of the sort to invite an audience to celebrate. Later, Watts speaks less of celebration than of actualization, the elicitation of reader participation. And again, yes, of course, what else could it be? These are poems, after all, meant to be read and heard, and Deuteronomy 32 is a profound and climactic demonstration of such. But once again, I think we need to be discriminating. Not all of God's poetry is uttered to people. Some is internal to the divine self. Can readers participate in that kind of poetry? Perhaps, but not always in order to celebrate. Perhaps instead in order to remember. But perhaps best of all, to contemplate and to imaginatively experience. Such ends are at work in all of the divine poetry of the Pentateuch, I think, not just the interior poetry of the Godhead, because that is the power of the lyric and its eventfulness. In his work on lyric poetry, Jonathan Culler has spoken of the power of lyric as that of apostrophe. Lyric poetry does not describe an event, but strives to be an event, in the present, in the now. That, Culler argues, is part of the literary form as such. It doesn't apply only to divine poetry as opposed to some other. It works at all times in lyric poetry. Eventfulness is connected also then to the work of reading and to interpreting poetry. The concealing or revealing aspect of biblical verse means that any interpretation involves as much the power of imaginative insight as any objective analysis, says Susan Gillingham. At that point, we seem to have come back to Watts' notion of readerly participation, but in a new key. It's not just us readers who make participation happen. The poetic form, too, is doing that work, facilitating it in us. Deuteronomy 2, this sounds a lot like Deuteronomy 32 and its poetic inscriptions. That poem also is a lyric, an event, a happening, a case of apostrophe. And of course, the lyric form can pass us on. It can press further than us, past us and somehow beyond us. Otherwise, one instance of participation would be once for all. But the poetic form of the lyric invokes and involves, evokes, even as it resists and eludes. With Gillingham, we can say that we're reminded in poetry of something more than we can evoke by ourselves. And that brings into our consciousness an awareness of a more profound reality, she says, older than the present order of things. That most profound reality should be capitalized, particularly in divine poetry, where the one who poeticizes is the most profound reality of all, the deity. And that internal divine poetry suggests still more. The language of poetry, Gillingham says, needs the poetic medium for much of its expression, because poetry, with its power of illusion, reminds us of the more hidden and mysterious truths which theology seeks to express. But the presence of divine poetry, especially interior divine poetry, suggests that it's not just the language of theology that needs the poetic medium. God's own language, the language of Ha-Theos himself, needs the same, and evidently for the same reasons. God speaks poetry to the divine self, sometimes even about the divine self. The Godhead participates in its own divine lyric, evoked, elicited, transformed, and more. An analogy of sorts to this last point is found in a passage from the Babylonian Talmud, and I end with this, where the rabbis explain a phrase in Isaiah that suggests that God prays. It's from chapter 56, and they say, this suggests that God prays, and they want to know, what does God pray? To whom, one might ask, does God pray? Well, obviously, God prays to himself, the rabbis say. But what does God pray? The rabbis have an answer. This, they say, is what God prays. May it be my will that my mercy may suppress my anger, and that my mercy may prevail over my other attributes, so that I may deal with my children in the attribute of mercy, and on their behalf stop short of the limit of strict justice. That's the prayer God prays to the divine self every day, according to the Babylonian Talmud. This prayer to God's self clearly depends on the Gnaden formal of Exodus 34, and it's facilitated by the same, not only its content, but also its interiority. Of course, as we've seen, it isn't just that one famous poem from Exodus that does that kind of work, whether for the deity or for those of us who belatedly read the divine poems now housed in Scripture. Any and all poems uttered by God to God's own self that include content about God suggest that any and all other poems about God, like, say, those uttered by Balaam in the book of Numbers, can also be seen, ultimately, as poems by God as well. Indeed, divine poems about God, given by God to others, like the priestly blessing in Numbers 6, suggest that every divine poem, replete with instruction, participation, and eventfulness, could be, and really is, cut of the same cloth. Even poems about God are by God and to God. And so it is that we get Scripture, the whole Bible, nothing less than the lively oracles, songs, and poems of God. And so it is that we get Scripture, the very poetry of heaven. It's for reasons like these, surely, that God speaks in poetry in the Pentateuch. Thank you.